Aloha and welcome to Your Heart Magic, an illuminating space where psychology, spirituality and heart wisdom meet. Here's your host, Dr. BethAnne Kapansky-Wright, the clinical psychologist with a mystic mind.
Aloha, everyone. This is Dr. BethAnne Kapansky-Wright, and welcome to Your Heart Magic. We are talking about the topic, living our truth, on the podcast today. And as everybody knows, I love all the topics we talk about on here. So I'm just as excited about this one as I always get. But what's really fun about this topic is that the day that I'm actually making this podcast is on the eclipse of the Scorpio full moon. And this is a moon that is about truth. It's about transformation. It is about taking what is secretive and bringing it out into the light. It is about looking at where have we kept a secret from ourselves or not been honest with ourselves? Where in our life are some things maybe in the shadows that we need to look at a little bit more clearly? So I didn't quite time it out this way, but as you know, synchronicity is all around us and magic is happening all the time in all these wonderful ways. And so I feel like today's very transformative energy is supporting this podcast, and it will continue to ripple for weeks to come whenever you might listen to these words. So, all right, living our truth. I think that this is one of those topics that when we talk about living our truth, it is something that sounds so easy to do. And yet it's also something that can be incredibly challenging. And I feel like we are really tapping into kind of the, we'll say like meat and potatoes of the spiritual experience when we stumble onto any topic that's actually very simple sounding in nature. And when we have to take it and live it and put it into action, we realize how hard it can be. And learning to live our truth is certainly one of those things. The secret to wellness is to live your truth. It's to be yourself. It's to be as authentic as possible and always as is possible. You know, that is really what good health and wellness and wholeness is about. It is about being our most authentic self in this world. And when we are able to do that, we usually are living in a space where we feel more aligned. We feel more at peace with our inner world. We might have to go through some transformation to get there, but usually our outer world will shift and eventually line up to reflect that inner world. And so all these beautiful things come from being our most authentic self. And when we talk about living our truth, I think living authentically is another way to phrase that. To me, what we're talking about in this topic is the authentic journey. If we are living our truth, we are living as authentically as possible. So easy to say and easy to conceptualize. And authenticity and truth have been some kind of big buzzwords that people love to throw around and make fun, inspirational quotes out of. And yet, I think that when it really comes to putting truth into action and really trying to live in a way where we are in beautiful integrity with ourselves, it can actually be quite a challenging thing to do because sometimes our truth will ask hard things of us. And I want to be clear that in this podcast, what I am really talking about is more our sense of experiential truth that might feel individual to us and our life and our heart. I'm not really talking about what I would call objective truth or truths that might be like scientifically measured or things that might be factual or provable or those kinds of things. I'm talking about more of our personal relationship with our truth and how do we know when something's true for us and how do we know what's in our hearts. And one of the things that many of us have experienced is just because something is true for us and is our best way forward does not mean it's somebody else's journey or their truth. So how do we separate and come into that and really winnow out the voice of ourself and the voice of our heart? And how do we learn to listen to that? And it is through learning to listen to that and tap into that voice that we are able to step forward in a more honest way and a more authentic way. So before we dive into some of the talking points that I jotted down to try and take what feels like a very fluid concept and make it a little bit more grounded so we can apply it, I want to share this kind of philosophy that I have that I work with truth, and it really informs how I think about the essence of truth. And this came from a angel message that I received several years back when I was receiving quite a bit of channeled messages and heart transmissions and kind of having a big growth period in my life. And this particular one that came through was for a time in my life where I was really working on boundaries, and I was working on what felt true for me in setting boundaries, what didn't feel true. I was running into some sticky stuff around just because somebody else wants me to do something, be something, or even embody a BethAnne that they understood me as, or maybe knew me as, years back, did not necessarily mean that that was my truth in that given moment. And it didn't mean that's who I was at that time. And I was really kind of grappling with some stuff coming up around, if I become what you need me to be to meet your projection of who you think I am, I'm actually not living my truth. That feels very dishonest to me. And it feels like a boundary violation. And as somebody who has really done a lot of work around codependency and not realizing that my primary purpose here is to be my most authentic self and to not please others. And when that is pleasing to others, awesome. That's so great. But that I don't exist to be what somebody else needs me to be. So I was really grappling with kind of some of those sticky empath lessons at the time. And I received this message about boundaries and truth and living our truth. And one of the lines that came through in this message was that truth is alive in love. And love always seeks to free itself, to become a higher expression. And so our truth seeks to free itself so that we can become a higher expression of love. That is one of those meditative, contemplative, kind of mind-blowing truisms, I think, that is simple to say. And you could spend a lot of time journaling about what that really means to you, and maybe even tapping into this whole ocean of knowledge and wisdom that comes from that statement. But the idea that truth is alive and that truth is connected to love, truth is alive in love. And love is always seeking to free itself to become a higher expression. And we know this about love. We know that love evolves. We witness in our lives, not through not just the development of our loved ones, the development of ourselves, but we will see our love evolve over time towards something, towards somebody. You know, one of the things about being in, we'll say, like long-term relationships, which could be marital, they could be really close friendship, it could be familial, is sometimes we'll look back and we'll say, wow, this is where we were at 5 years ago or 10 years ago, and this is who we are now. And there can be this appreciation for how things have changed, for how they've evolved, for what core essences of the relationship still hold true, for how much has maybe shifted, and there's been growth that's happened and more honesty that's happened, and things that maybe have changed in a different direction to suit both of who the individuals are now. That's what evolution looks like. And so we know that love evolves. It doesn't stay stagnant. If you try and make somebody be exactly what you need them to be, because that's like your perception of this is who you are when you're most lovable, doesn't work very well. That's usually when relationships start imploding. And when somebody does that to us, that's usually when we start imploding and we say, like, I feel fenced in here. I got to break free. Like, this feels like a cage of expectation. And so truth and love are linked. And since we know that love And love is light, and light is a constantly evolving expression of God, of source creator, of spirituality, of this living mana and living energy that's all around us. Truth is a kindred spirit of that. And so our truth is always evolving. So this is really the philosophy that I work with when I think about the concept of truth. It is the construct that I currently have in my mind for how I frame truth and how I frame my relationship with it. And that I feel kind of ties into some of the talking points that we are talking about today, because it sort of shows the umbrella from the paradigm that I work from and how I understand our relationship to truth and living our truth. So our first point is that truth is something that is an evolving process, and living our truth is a process. And I feel like this is important to think about because sometimes we can have a very fixed notion of the truth. We can have a fixed notion of who we are and who we're supposed to be. Our belief systems are not necessarily our deeper truth. Many times they will be in alignment, especially the more that we have done. But there are times that people will have a belief system where they were raised or taught a certain something, and they adopted that belief system because they learned it in their family system, or maybe a religious institution that they were part of, or a school system that they were part of, or some sort of community or subculture. And this belief system is based on maybe a credence of beliefs or values and norms. And then a normalization that kind of happens from how this group understands whatever this belief system is, and the customs, and again, the norms and values that are set up within that particular group. And so sometimes somebody will think, well, this is who I am because this is what I believe. And as we grow, particularly if we're going through a spiritual awakening, sometimes what we find is that the truth inside of us can come into conflict with some of those things that we might thought that we believed and that we might have thought held true for us. So truth is an evolving thing. And it is something that, like I said, our beliefs might reflect it. But I think a better measure of truth is being able to really talk about the language of the heart and what holds true for our heart at some point in time. If somebody were to say, well, I believe this, and this is my truth, a more honest way to put that might be, at the moment, this, and this is what I've learned, and it resonates with my heart the most. And so I know this to be true for me. Do you hear the difference? It's dropping out of the head and what we think we know and what we think ought to be, and dropping into our heart space and asking, does this resonate with me? Does this feel in integrity with me? Does this feel honest with me? Am I able to be my authentic self within this construct, within this truth that I say that I believe, within this way that I am enacting this truth in my life? And our relationship to that is what continues to change over the lifespan, because as we grow and we evolve and we challenge some of the things that maybe we were taught, and we learn more about ourselves, our relationship with ourselves deepens. And as our relationship with ourself deepens, our truth can deepen, and we can come to new knowledge and new understanding of ourselves. So truth is a process. It is something that we don't just say, this is my truth, and these are all the ways I live it. That's great. We can do that to some extent. But I think a more accurate way to say it is that we are all living our truth the best that we know how. And we can't be probably in 100% alignment with our truth every single day, all of the time, because we're constantly discovering deeper nuances to our truth. And so I think the best that we can do is that as we tap into a new truth within ourselves, or something comes and we can see things more clearly, we take action at that time to live in a way that is more in alignment with that. And there are, I think, a process to living our truth. And this is really important, I think, to talk about, because as I'm saying this, I'm flashing back to when I was going through my divorce. And it was 2011, 2010, 2011 were kind of these very changeful years for me. And I've talked about that's when my really big spiritual awakening initially took place. And before I got to a place of being divorced and kind of stepping into this new version of BethAnne, there was a lot of upheaval going on in my life at the time. And if you would have asked me at the beginning of this process, like, what is your truth versus what you would have asked me at the end, those were very different truths. My understanding to what was going on inside of me and inside my soul really shifted at the time, as it was meant to. Like I said, this is an evolving process. And so sometimes we are in circumstances or we are in a place in our life where we know that something is no longer right for us. Maybe we know what our truth isn't. Something isn't sitting right. Something feels uncomfortable. Something feels like it doesn't quite fit us anymore. But we have no idea what the counterpart to that is. We haven't answered the equation yet. If not this, then this, because we don't know what this is. So we kind of find ourselves in this nebulous space in between. And we are trying to figure out, well, I know that this no longer feels is honest, and I'm not quite that person anymore, but I don't know who I'm stepping into. So there are times that if somebody were to say, what's your truth right now? We might be like, I don't know. I am struggling here. I have no idea what my truth is. I always come back to a space where I'm like, well, I know my truth is always love, and it is always that I'm going to follow my heart. So if everything else feels confusing and I don't have clarity yet, at least I know that much. And I've really come to embrace over the last decade that one of my truths is I can trust myself to figure it out. I haven't dropped myself yet, and spirit hasn't dropped me either. But in terms of our relationship with ourselves, we can always come to a place and say, my future self will figure it out somehow. Because so far I've been figuring stuff out, So I think that it can help sometimes to create like a core truth that will always hold true for you. So if everything else is shifting, you at least have a touchstone to come into. But I think when we are in this process of truth, and we were to try and break this down into stages or steps, the first stage would be that before we can live our truth, we have to acknowledge our truth to ourselves. We have to learn how to turn on the lights in rooms that have felt dark to us and look around with more clarity and have a sense of honesty with ourselves. And it can take a long time to get to that point in the process. Sometimes we are actively lying to ourselves. And if somebody were to really pin us down and say, like, you are lying to yourself and you are doing all these things to avoid facing your truth, some part of us might know and be like, that is right. Like a bestie might see that in you. Somebody who's known you forever, who's like, what's going on with you? Because it looks like you're not dealing with your life in this area. And I don't think you're being honest here. Sometimes somebody might see that, but a lot of times we're not trying to actively lie to ourselves. We're just confused and we don't know because we're in process. Again, truth is not black and white. It's not fixed, and it's not something that instantaneously we know what it is. It's something that we uncover, we dig for. We might try on different lesser versions of truth and say, maybe this is how I feel. Maybe this is how I feel. Sometimes I call this the truest of truths. We can have like paler versions of truth that are maybe a strand of the greater ball of yarn of our big truth. And so we might spend some time on one of those strands of a paler truth, and it's an aspect of our truth, but maybe not the greater one. So making this practical, back that summer and that couple year arc period that I talked about, where I was really struggling and I was about to go through this big transition and divorce and all of those things. I did not know what my truth was at the time. I didn't know what I was feeling. I just knew that I was really changing. And I spent a lot of times in the mountains that year. And that's when I really got into mountain running. And distance running and some of those things, because they gave me space to think and to process and just be in the process. And one of the beautiful things that nature did for me is I really think she kind of reflected back the aspects of the truth that I was able to see at that point in time in any given moment as I was ready to see them. So it's not like I had this big epiphany where I had my life figured out all at once. It's more like I was in this really messy process, but I was going into an honest space, and that was nature. And she would help me see these aspects of my truth and was slowly helping me piece together a little bit more of an understanding and vocabulary for what was going on inside of me, which was this birth and this awakening of soul in a bigger way and a new depth of self that was coming out. So we start with acknowledging it to ourselves. And we start with being able to ask ourselves the question, am I actively lying to myself about anything? And if your answer to that is yes, then your starting point is to stop lying. And it is to simply begin to acknowledge some of those hard truths to yourself. What's interesting about this, I think, is that we're afraid that if we admit them, that things might change. This is a rational fear. Because there often is a point in the process of truth that if you are invested in living your truth, you might be called to change. So there are many times that we will stay in phase one of kind of dodging our truth or sort of knowing what it is, but not dealing with it because we need to maintain status quo. And what I would say to that is if you find yourself there right now, then you probably have good reason. I think sometimes we beat ourselves up for not evolving or being as spiritual or whatever superlative we want to put on it as we can. But how about if you're in a relationship, let's say there's children involved, and you know what your truth is. You know, your truth is maybe you wouldn't be in this relationship, but the idea of not being in it means not only massive change for you, but it would mean it for your family and your children and their well-being. And so you struggle because you have a truth that if it wasn't for your circumstances, you might choose a different path. But because of your circumstances, you are choosing to stay in this thing right now that maybe you've realized isn't serving you. Who's to say that's not valid? And who's to say that spirit can't come and support you right there in that space if you're struggling? And who's to say if you can't have an honest chat with your guides and your angels and say, here's my truth. I know I wouldn't be in this if we didn't have kids. I know that I would probably be better served being with somebody else. I know these things. I also know that I don't want to break up my family unit. I care about this. That is your truth too. So please don't judge yourself if you are in a place where you're struggling with something and you know that you are kind of having to toe the line with something and you don't know. You wish you had more freedom and you're afraid if you admit it fully what might happen. Give yourself grace for that, because spirit has a lot of compassion. And when we talk about living our truth, and we're going to tap into this point next, it really comes down to doing what's right for us. So just because we acknowledge a hard truth to ourselves doesn't necessarily mean that the automatic next step is now you have to change it. Sometimes truth will ask that of us, but usually we will not be asked to do anything. Well, we'll never be asked to do something that doesn't serve our highest good. And I feel like there is a process to this where sometimes somebody can sit with the hard truth for a decade, and it's not until later on that they're able to live it or they're really called to change in it. So don't be afraid that if you face that stuff, it automatically means these horrible things are going to happen or your life is going to change. People are really afraid sometimes of change, and sometimes we keep the status quo for a reason. And sometimes there's a good at the time it serves us to do so. So we're being gracious on ourselves. There's no judgment or beating yourself up today for wherever you're at with this. It is all good. It's all okay. We're just talking about ideas and different layers of how we live our truth. What I have found, though, is that when we acknowledge truths to ourselves, that oftentimes what will start to come from that is really claiming that truth or owning that truth. And that is a little bit of what I would say the next stage of the living your truth process. First we have to see it and kind of name it and know what it is. And then when we own it or claim it is usually when we're able to say, I believe this is true for me. It is what might allow us to tell somebody else, this is what's going on with me right now, and this is what I feel about this. Owning it might be what precipitates making a decision or acting on our truth in some way. But when we own our truth, we are taking responsibility and accountability for something that might feel true to us. So a good example of this might be, let's say that there's something that you want to change in your life and you have kind of grappled with making a change and you decide that I don't think this is serving for me. And I want to change this thing. Let's say you've been involved in a group or doing something, and we'll say it's a social group, and it just no longer, you don't like some of the stuff going on in there. You don't like the direction. You're kind of seeing backstabbing, maybe some pettiness, and you feel like, I really think I want to do something different with my time and start branching out into friend groups. So something interesting that sometimes happens when we're trying to own a truth is that we really get caught up on, why am I feeling this way? Is it okay for me to feel this way? Is it okay for me to make these choices for myself? Particularly if other people, if it involves more than just ourselves and other people have not made that choice. So sometimes we will start looking around for permission in order to live our truth. And I'm kind of getting into the next talking point. So I'll just go into what it was, since we're already right there. And that is the idea that we are really the only ones who can claim our truths for ourselves. Nobody can give us permission for something that we feel is true for us. Nobody else can fully validate that. They can't make us live it. They can't tell us, yes, it's okay for you to feel this way. It's perfectly acceptable, and somehow make it okay, especially if it is something that maybe feels hard or that feels like a big leap for you in your life. If you are making a break from something because your truth is calling you in a different direction, then the group that you are making a break from is probably not going to validate your decision. And this is something I ran into quite a bit during my divorce, because at the time I was stepping out of a church system that I really had a foot out the door for a long, long time, like a foot and maybe just like a tiny little toe in it, at that point in my life. And this was a system that did not really believe in something like divorce. And so there just really wasn't in the vocabulary of some of the individuals that were still in that system that I was still connected to at the time. And this was a very painful time in my life, because I had come to this hard truth inside of me that in order to be my fuller expression of self, I can't be in this life I've created for myself. And it was bigger than that. I also saw where neither myself nor my former partner would be able to truly be who we were meant to be in this world. So I had all these reasons for kind of doing the things that I did. And most importantly, the voice of my soul spoke. It's kind of like the lightning bolt of destiny hit me. And I think I was 33 at the time, and just ripped through my life. If you do the tarot and you've seen the Tower card, that was the Tower. And the upheaval and the change was real, and it was so disruptive. And I had really no choice but to listen to this soulful voice inside of me that said, like, you will slowly die if you do not go become and expand and step into this bigger version of self. And I don't know that I would have put it into those words at the time. I hadn't quite experienced all that. Just something was radically wrong. And what I found is that I could not look to the group that I was stepping out of to give me approval or validation for the decision that I was making. I could not look to them to say, oh, your reasons sound very valid and thought out. I could not look to them to validate an experience of myself that they'd not experienced within themselves. and that they'd not experienced, period, in their life. So they had no reference point to understand why I was so insistent. This is what has to happen. And so when we are claiming and owning our truth, this is probably the most important part of the process. It can be scary to take an action step once we claim our truth, but I've often found that running from our truth and not wanting to admit it and the process of just accepting it and being like, no, this is where I'm at, that is usually more painful for us. And even if we have to take hard actions because of that, oftentimes they can feel like a relief because we're no longer in conflict with ourselves. And that's a little bit of what I experienced. It was a horrible time in my life. I have a small list of things that you could not pay me to repeat. And that was one of those times in my life that I would not go back in time and relive it. There's many things that many of us feel like that about, but it was a horrible time in my life. And just horrible at that age to be going through, such a traumatic divorce and feeling like I was letting so many people down. There was a lot of shame. There was a lot of judgment. I had people say things to me like, well, I just don't understand how you can break your vows before God. I had a couple people suggest that I might not be going in an upward direction when I crossed over, that I might be going in a downward direction, in the afterlife, and things that I didn't subscribe to because they weren't my understanding. But the judgment and the harshness was, it was real, and it was really hard. And it was very lonely. Truth can be a lonely road. And I did have people come along beside, and people who were willing to say, I believe in you. I'm going to walk by you. I've known you for a long time. You're still the same BethAnne, and you need love just as much now as you did a couple months ago when I thought about you a little bit differently. I had a few people do that. Not a lot. I lost a lot of friends at that time, and they weren't friends. They were acquaintances and people who wore a mask of being a friend, but not a real friend. And it was a lonely road. And yet the beautiful thing that came from that is it really forced me to own my truth. Because if somebody makes it easy for us to own our truth, are we really owning it? It's nicer when they do that. We feel supported. So it's not a bad thing when people validate it. But if we're going through something and we feel misunderstood, it is extremely hard. It is isolating, but there is an opportunity in there to learn to hold your own hand and walk yourself through the experience and say, I know this to be true for me. And part of how I knew it was true is despite the fact that people were disappointed, upset, gossiping about me, all of those things, I was still doing it. At no point did I turn back and say, and revert to my former people pleaser self and say oh, I made a mistake. You guys are all right and I'm wrong. I kept walking forward. And part of who I am now, and the speaking voice I've developed and the teaching voice I've developed and a lot of the wisdoms that I've learned the hard way and now I turn around and teach, part of those came from that time. That was the breeding grounds and the soil and the seeds that were planted to really become a stronger version of myself and somebody who was much more rooted in my truth and who was able to learn to start to discern when I am veering from something that's true or something is no longer true for me. So all these beautiful gifts came from that time. So when we're owning our truth, nobody can give us permission to live it. We're the only ones who can do that for ourselves. And yet there's so much freedom and beauty there. And spirit can be with you with that. You are not alone. Your spiritual connection and your heart connection are two of the strongest things that you have, that you can keep coming back into that and saying, this still feels right for me. This still feels true for me. And you can keep moving forward on your path with that intact. And there usually is I wrote down call to action at some point in this process of living our truth. It is one thing to chase a truth down, to identify it, to write it in the pages of our journal. And then there's the ownership piece. where we do some work around it and have that internal struggle and that internal conflict and kind of have a overcoming of that internal conflict where we finally find peace because at least we're being honest with ourselves and we know how we really feel. And usually there is a point then that we have to think, how do I take this out into the world and live it? And here's the beautiful thing about this. That's going to depend on you. It's going to depend on your circumstances. It's going to depend on what your truth is. It is going to depend on your understanding of that and how you feel called to live it. Sometimes we're called for big, massive change. Obviously, the time I was talking about in my life was one of the most highly disruptive times that I've experienced in my human lifespan. And will always stand out in my mind as kind of one of those things that sort of drove like a big stake in the ground. And if I were to draw out a little timeline and map, here's my journey, there's a huge X right there, marks the spot of crossroads of change. And I went in a different direction. But things are not always that dramatic. Sometimes living our truth might be, I'm a spiritual being. Okay, that's a truth that I think many of us would agree with who are listening to this podcast. And what if you are wanting to step into your intuition and your spirituality more? Well, first of all, I think you being able to claim, well, I am a spiritual being, and to feel empowered to work your spiritual connection. Something that we talk about a lot on Your Heart Magic is the idea that you are empowered to work with your angels, to access your Akashic records, to begin to venture out into things that you may or may not have had experience with, or maybe you're not sure how to do it and you feel like somebody else does these things, but not me. And I often think that sometimes when it comes to our spiritual connection, we're waiting for somebody to come along and give us permission and say, yes, you are now ready to do this. You are now ready to do this. And oftentimes, we can just own that for ourselves and say, well, I am a spiritual being. Just because I am really stepping into my intuitive gifts does not mean I'm going to go hang a shingle on the outside of my house that says psychic in session, daily readings. We can own a truth for ourselves inside of us and know it to be true for us without necessarily having to take some big action step like that. So let's say our truth is that we're owning our spirituality and we choose to see ourselves as intuitive beings. I've worked with a lot of women who sometimes say something like, well, I want to develop my intuition more. And one of the things that I tell them, well, your first step is to accept that you're already intuitive. You already have that intuitive alchemy that you need to work with your intuition in a more focused way to see what are your unique gifts. So start seeing yourself as intuitive right now. Don't think that you have to take some course where you get a certification in being intuitive. If you want to do that, awesome. There's great stuff out there. There's great books out there. It is how we develop our practical skill set. But start seeing yourself as intuitive right now. Start seeing yourself as capable of accessing energetic information, of reading energy, of having conversations with your guides and angels. Start seeing yourself right now. Own that truth. And then our action step stems from that. So maybe you've decided to own that truth. And that is what makes you decide to sign up for a course. That is what makes you decide to get a deck of oracle cards and start giving yourself readings and learning the language of the oracle a little bit more so you become more proficient. First, we have to own it, and then we take that action step. And I can share that as I was stepping into my intuitive gifts, this was an interesting process because I very much relate to the talking points I'm bringing in this podcast with what I experienced as I was gradually going through the process of owning my gifts as an intuitive. And what was happening is that in the year 2015, 2016, and I was living in Alaska at the time, I had gone through all this change. I knew I was really intuitive. I knew my spiritual gifts were growing. I was receiving Akashic readings. I could pick up a deck of cards and do readings for other people. So I knew I was intuitive, but I knew my gifts were meant to grow. And when I moved to Kauai in the year 2017, and I really wanted to start doing Akashic readings more and make that part of my business. I had just been doing them kind of on the side for fun, but I'd done them long enough at that point that I felt like, no, like I have a gift here, I think that I can share with others. And I'd like to create this as an offering for other people. Well, I needed to be seen for that. So I'd owned at least that much. And that was a process to get there of just owning the truth of I work with the records. I am a reader. I am an intuitive. I am psychically gifted. And then the next step was, what are my action steps around that? And that was a process in and of itself. I remember the first time that I offered, I did a one and done thing. We'll never do it again. But I did an offering of free mini intuitive readings, like on my personal Facebook page for Christmas of 2017. And I think I had like 45 people sign up and I capped it. I was like, okay, done. Nobody else is signing up. And everybody got a little audio recording, and I kind of brought in some of their records and information and sent it to them. And I was so scared to drop that post. Now, it was my truth to take a step and to be more public about my intuitive gifts. And my truth wasn't so much, you have to go on Facebook and offer free readings. It was just, I needed to live my truth somehow. Like the deeper truth was, I am an intuitive and I need to see myself as such. And I am seeing myself as such, but I don't think other people even know I have these gifts. So how do we tell people that we have changed in the night, that we have become something else? That's a process too. So it started with that. And it started with slowly using language like intuitive gifts, intuitive healer. I would play around with psychic a little bit and go back and forth between psychic, intuitive, mystic. I've tried out like all the different words throughout the years. I've had different labels where I'll be like, I am this. And that will feel super aligned for a period of time. And then it will stop feeling as aligned. A lot of times I just grow out of it, or it doesn't matter as much. This is one of the things too that I have found as we live our truth, that we often attach a label to what our truth is or try and put it into words because we are trying to make a concrete way to show the world, this is who I am now. And so we have to nail it down somehow, right? Labels can be good for that. But since we know truth is an evolving thing, it's alive, it's constantly evolving. Sometimes those labels, we outgrow them and they no longer feel true to us. And we feel like we're actually transcending this mold or box that we created originally to kind of house ourselves in so that we could fit ourselves into it and package it and show people, this is who I am. And so the more comfortable we become with who we are and the more we grow, the more I've often found that we lose the need to attach a label to it, or we're a little bit more fluid with language. We don't feel as defensive about it or feel like we need to prove ourselves. So this was a real sticking point for me. And I think many of you might be able to relate to this in your own lives, that when I was first kind of coming out of the closet as an intuitive, I really felt like I needed to defend my gifts. And I actually never had somebody that I can think of like directly say to me, you're lying. These things aren't true. Now, there was a lot of voices in my head where I imagined that people were thinking that, or imagine that they were imagining these things, because I know that the norm of our world isn't necessarily the most accepting of psychic phenomenon and these kinds of gifts, and so I was defensive against kind of this story that's behind it, that somehow you can't be a grounded, rational, highly intelligent person and also say, yes, I believe in all of these things and I'm experiencing them, that somehow those can't coexist. So I was really running into old stories in my mind where I felt like there might be pushback. And so oftentimes if I was talking about it, I felt like I had to like over explain myself or almost like answer people's objections before they even had time to make those objections. And what I've actually found throughout the years is nobody's ever really said anything to me. I've had people who have like unfollowed a blog I've done when I've done certain posts. I've had people who've unfriended me 5-6 years ago. I would really notice that stuff and it would really hurt. And I was really grappling with that sense of nobody else can give you permission to live your truth. And it's not up to them to validate it, to make it true for you. It's up to you to live it. And earlier when I said truth can be a lonely road and truth can hurt, like that was the hurt. That was the hurt of the ego. That was the hurt of part of me feeling rejected. And yet the beauty is that there was freedom in that, because what I eventually found over time is that life goes on and the right people stay with us. And many of them grow with us because they're evolving in their own truth as well. And so sometimes something we're experiencing, they have had evolution and they say, oh my gosh, something similar has been happening to me, or I relate to that so much because. And over time, I became much less attached to somebody else's beliefs or what they might project on me or what they might think about what I'm saying, and just more comfortable being like, well, this is who I am. And the right ones will relate to that. And those that aren't are free to walk their own paths. Oh, and that ties in so beautifully with the next point that I wanted to share. And that is living what is true for us does not make somebody else wrong. When we live in a way that is true and authentic for ourselves, it's not about making others wrong. It is about understanding that if we are in our hearts and we are listening to our guidance the best we know how, then we are able to say with clarity, this is true for me as a soul on my journey at this point in time. And we don't need to be defensive about it. We don't need to get upset. I didn't need to get upset back in those years that somebody rejected my gifts and unfollowed a post or something because I talked about, having interactions with my brother in the afterlife. I didn't need to judge the person or be like, well, they're just really narrow-minded, or say things to tear them down somehow in order to validate myself. That happens. Like that's a really human reaction to have, where we, kind of need to deconstruct somebody else in order to reassure ourselves that we're on the right path. So that happens to all of us. No judgment there. We just try not to stay in it. But ultimately, living our truth is not about somehow thinking that we're more right than somebody else. It's just about recognizing what's right for us and having the freedom, giving ourselves the freedom to live that, and recognizing that somebody else might be in a very different place on their journey as a soul. Maybe they signed up to have very different experiences. Something that's not uncommon in the Akashic records is I've opened records before from somebody who might believe something about the world that is maybe very different than my understanding. And I can very clearly see in their records that they came into this life wanting to embrace this certain belief system, because as a soul, that is how they wanted to experience the world. And they had work to do within that belief system. And we can always understand that somebody who sees things differently or believes something different or has a different truth, we don't have to feel that we're against them in order to free ourselves. We can say they're not for me. We can say, I don't agree within our hearts. We can set boundaries and make choices and say, wow, this feels so incompatible with where they're at. I think we've gone in different directions now, but we don't have to like hate on somebody or create a division there. That's not what truth is about. Truth is really about freeing ourselves to become a higher expression in love. And so when we can truly free ourselves and live our truth, we're actually able to release judgment of the other person and say, I free myself not to meet your expectation of me, and I free you not to meet my expectation of you, and may we both be safe and guided and walk towards our highest truth. That's where the freedom is. So this is really about soul sovereignty and owning what's in our hearts. I'm smiling. I just looked at the clock and it's 11:11 as I'm saying those words, which are angel numbers that usually mean you're heading in the right direction, and pay attention. And they mean that the angels are with us and they're listening. So I'm going to read one thing today before I wrap up. And this is, a channeled message that came through back in the summer of 2020, where I was kind of grappling with some things after everything that was going on in the States with George Floyd. I've talked about this story on the podcast before, where I had a newsletter coming out that week and was trying to figure out how to stay in my integrity and address what was happening in this newsletter, but also keep the content of the newsletter. It was not about, racial divides. My newsletter was about intuition, but I felt like I could not ignore the opportunity to say something. And there was a lot of voices and opinions happening at that time. If any of you, live in the States and remember, it was a real heightened time. And I was trying to figure out, what is my truth? What is the most true thing for me to do? And this is a little bit of the message that came through. Doing the right thing for you doesn't have to be about making somebody else wrong. Making others wrong doesn't make you right. Throw out the right, throw out the wrong, throw out the judgment and the labels. You must learn to see beyond sides. Ask yourself instead, is this loving? And if I do this, is this loving? Then do that. Do what is loving and move in the direction of love. This is the only way to create a compass of truth that will help you navigate the troubled waters going on with your planet at this time. If you feel lost, seek and ask love to reveal itself to you. Pause and wait and call on love. If it's not loving, then it's not coming from a place of truth. And this is how you learn to distinguish the truth. Does it make you feel more open? Does it make you feel more connected? Does it make you feel more free, even if being free challenges you to take a hard step? If it doesn't leave you open, if it doesn't leave you connected to your fellow human beings, if it causes fear and doubt in your heart, it is not coming from a place of love's truth. Truth will never enslave you. Truth will never conquer you. Truth will never subjugate you. Truth will not ask you to hate another, for truth is love and love is truth. So when you move towards truth, you are moving towards love. And when you move towards love, you move towards truth. Mic drop. I feel like nothing I can say is going to top a message that was from the angels, that bit of wisdom. I have returned to that as a compass over and over throughout the years, and to just kind of bring this home to a final resting place. If you are in doubt with anything in your life and you do not know what your truth is, but you're willing to seek it, just ask yourself the question, what is the most loving thing I know to do right now? And maybe the most loving thing is to rest. Maybe it is to breathe. Maybe it's to take space. Maybe it is to not speak before you're ready to speak. Maybe it's to have a hard conversation. I don't know what the most loving thing is. You know that. Your heart knows that. And if you can do that and just keep coming back to that, you can't miss your truth. You will be living in your heart. You will be living your truth, because truth is love and love is truth. And both of them are always seeking to free us and to open us up so we can become a higher expression of love, of ourselves, of who we are created to be and express ourselves on as souls on the planet at this time. All right. Yay. That was so happy Truth Day. Happy eclipse. That wraps up today's podcast topic. And next week, we are going to be talking about the topic of boundaries. I actually wrote down what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours, or is it? We're going to be talking about not just boundaries. How do we set boundaries? I'm going to piggyback some on today's message, where I was talking about how I received this channeling on boundaries and about setting boundaries and living boundaries. And like, how can we tell in our hearts when we need to set a boundary in our situation? And particularly for individuals who are highly empathic, it can be a little bit challenging for us with boundaries because we might feel what somebody else is feeling and have a hard time figuring out, well, where do I begin in this situation? And then we're also going to talk about when we set a boundary, how do we do that in a way that is maybe respectful to the other person? There's an interesting trend happening right now with people setting boundaries that cut the other person out of the equation entirely. And it's kind of like, well, this is my truth and this is what's right for me. And I'm disconnecting from this relationship. And we're going to tap into some of that. I actually think this boundaries topic might be a multiple part topic. So I'll see what presents itself when I sit down to kind of bring this through for next week. But we're going to look at when do we maybe set the firm boundary and when can we set a boundary and how, but maybe we need to do it a little bit more kinder. And what are some of the considerations around that right now? And why is the dialogue shifting about all of that at this time? So that is coming up next week on Your Heart Magic. And until then, have an amazing week. I hope it's magical. I hope it's beautiful. And be well, be love, be you, and be magic.
You've been listening to Your Heart Magic with Dr. BethAnne Kapansky-Wright. Tune in next week for a new episode to support and empower your light.